Psychological studies begin as questions. How does a person with severe brain damage behave? Do smart parents have smart children? How does reminding someone of their race or gender change their performance on a test? Psychologists turn these questions into hypotheses. Do smart parents have smart children is changed to parents who have high scores on intelligence tests have children with similarly high scores. Then they design a study to test the hypothesis in an efficient way that reduces potential confounds, or factors that could explain the results but aren't directly measured or addressed by the study. Depending on the question and on the hypothesis, psychologists will choose one of three main types of research designs. A first type of research design is called descriptive. Descriptive studies aim only to gather data to present a complete picture of a given subject. Psychologists might use a survey to assess the state of mental health on college campuses. The results wouldn't tell them anything about the causes of mental illness in college students, but it would give a complete picture of the problem. To answer one of the questions we began with, how does a person with severe brain damage behave, psychologists might use a case study or a close examination of one person with a particular problem. Phineas Gage, a railroad construction foreman in the 19th century, is a classic example of such a case study. In an accident at a railroad construction site, he had a large metal rod driven through his head. He not only survived, but was fully functioning and lived for another 12 years. But several people close to him remarked that they noticed his personality had changed and that he'd become irritable and was unable to hold a job. Though Gage's case alone could not prove anything definitive about his particular brain injury and emotion regulation, it did help psychologists make better hypotheses in the future about the relationship with these things. Correlational studies try to figure out the relationship between two or more variables, which could be anything you can measure, like behavior, age, or gender. This relationship is represented by a number called the Pearson correlation coefficient that ranges from -1 to 1. Think of it like this. If you plotted all of your data points on a graph, a perfect correlation of 1 would look like a perfect line of points with a positive slope. If the correlation were less strong, the data points would look more like a cloud clustered around a line. Now, to answer the question, do smart parents have smart children, two variables psychologists might measure are parents' IQ and children's IQ. They would then administer IQ tests to a very large number of families and determine statistically how related the parents' scores were to their children's scores. If they're really related, the correlation coefficient will be closer to 1 or -1. If not, it'll be closer to 0. In the case of parent-child IQ, studies have found a correlation of about 0.35 between these variables. This is mildly positive, which means that a higher parent IQ is somewhat associated with a higher child IQ, but not as much as if the correlation were something more like 0.85, something closer to 1. If the researchers had found a negative correlation, represented by a number between 0 and -1, like -0.4, that would mean that higher parental IQ is actually associated with lower child IQ. These variables are still related, but in a negative sense. So an increase in parent IQ corresponds with a decrease in child IQ. If you plotted some data with a negative correlation, it would look like a cloud clustered around a line that had a negative slope. A correlation of 0 basically means that the variables aren't related to each other at all, and it would look just like a random cloud if plotted on a graph. Now, an important shortcoming of correlational research is the problem of determining causation. As tempting as it might be to assume so, correlation is not causation. Though there is a moderate positive correlation between parents' IQ and children's IQ, this doesn't mean that a high parental IQ causes a high child's IQ. Though in this particular case, it seems unlikely that the parent's high IQ is caused by the child's, this is a possibility that can't be ruled out by correlational research. It is also possible, even likely, that both high IQs are caused by some third external factor, like high income or socioeconomic status. To determine causation, psychologists must conduct experimental research. This also involves variables, but in this case, they're distinguished as independent and dependent. Psychologists change the independent variable and look at what happens to the dependent variable. Some psychologists hypothesize that women and racial minorities might experience something called stereotype threat when they take tests. Since these groups are stereotyped as being not as good at math as white men, The anxiety they experience by worrying that their performance will confirm this negative stereotype actually makes them end up doing worse. Psychologists have tested this in many situations, using awareness of race or gender identity as the independent variable and test performance as the dependent variable. One group administered a difficult section of a standardized test to two groups of African American and European American students. The first group was led to believe that the test measured intelligence. The second was not. In the first group, there was a wide performance gap between African American and European American students. In the second group, this gap was greatly reduced. The researchers concluded that worrying about confirming negative stereotypes about intelligence had actually made the African American students perform worse. Similar results have been found for women in chess competitions and entrepreneurship. Experimental research is powerful, but it's limited in a really important way. Psychologists simply can't manipulate all the variables they might be interested in. Now, sometimes it's just impossible. If a psychologist were interested in the differences between female and male leadership, they couldn't just instate a female leader in a company formerly led by a man. The company board would probably have something to say about that. But sometimes experimental research is possible, but highly unethical. To experimentally determine what kinds of trauma were most likely to cause post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, psychologists would have to submit large numbers of people to different kinds of trauma and potentially debilitate them with PTSD symptoms for the rest of their lives. Well, let's quickly go over the three types of research designs once again. Descriptive studies seek only to document. A case study like Phineas Gage is an example of this. Correlational studies try to establish a relationship between two variables, like parents' IQ and children's IQ, although correlation does not equal causation. Finally, experimental research looks to study causation, like with the example of stereotype threat and test performance, but it can't be used in every situation due to practical and ethical concerns.
This is just a sample. Get instant access to our complete library of free courses. Visit us now at www.education-portal.com.